Welcome, Shifting Left and Moving Forward, 2025 Modern Data Development with MotherDuck and Dagster. So today we're going to be talking about the Bluesky end-to-end data project that myself and Colton worked on. We'll also discuss the power of MotherDuck, and then that'll lead us into a discussion on shifting left in data engineering, as well as a discussion on modern data workflows and how to best bring AI to bear for data folks. And then we'll have a Q&A session. So the speakers are myself. I'm Alex Noonan. I'm a developer advocate here at Dagster. I've been a Dagster fan for some time. You may know me from data Twitter. That's probably where I'm most active, mostly for jokes. But I do data stuff too. Colton, Jacob, you want to introduce yourselves?
Sure, yeah, I'm Colton. I'm a developer advocate here at Dagster Labs, and I've been doing data engineering for a while now, from consulting to working at other startups and like financial institutions.
Awesome. Hey everybody, I'm Jacob. I also spend a little bit of time on data Twitter and I work at MotherDuck as a developer advocate. My kind of experience coming into the modern data stack and this type of stuff is really from a place of personal exploration and really just wanting to never be blocked by IT ever. And so happy to bring those superpowers to the group here.
All right, thanks, guys. So we recently completed this end-to-end data platform where we use Dagster in addition with Bluesky data to ingest data into an R2 bucket, do some dbt transformations using a MotherDuck data warehouse, and finally serving a Power BI dashboard. And having all of those enveloped within a Dagster project was pretty powerful. Because like a BI tool is usually something that isn't included in orchestration tools as it's seen like outside of that context. But anybody that's worked in doing like the business intelligence development can tell you that what happens upstream of your dashboards is super important. And having that visibility and command and control really empowers data analysts to like understand the lineage and state of their data and also build harder reports so they aren't running into as many like break fixes and issues related to that. I'm going to drop the link to the repo in the Zoom chat.
Yep, I've actually already done it.
Oh, very well. Colton, you want to kick off discussion about ingestion?
Yeah, so I'll be talking about the ingestion. There was actually the link to the project there. And as Alex was saying, we are ingesting data from Bluesky, which if you're not familiar with it, it's very similar to Twitter. It's a decentralized social media platform. And thankfully, they offer an SDK to be able to ingest data. And Bluesky actually runs on this Atmosphere protocol, AT-Proto. And it allows you to have like endpoints to query things and to tweet and do all those kinds of actions. But for our use case and ingesting that data, we were able to just use their Python SDK, which made it really simple. And to do that in Dagster, we leveraged a resource. So if you look at our project, we created a custom AT-Proto resource. And resources in Dagster are a way to create reusable code that you'll use across all of your assets. So we abstracted away that SDK here and also implemented some logic for authenticating. So on lines 14 through 16, you can see that we are calling authentication and we're maintaining the session token as well. One thing to note on this ingestion side is the Bluesky APIs limit how often you can make requests over a certain time period. And that authentication request is one of those requests that count towards that limit. So maintaining a session in your resource is pretty valuable, especially in this project. We have partitioned assets that are all running in parallel, and you want that to persist through the resource calls on each asset. And then next slide. Yeah, and then using that resource. So we're ingesting a couple different things from Bluesky. So one, we're ingesting the starter pack. And starter packs are something that were introduced in Bluesky so that you could easily follow a lot of people. And for example, there's this data people starter pack that has a lot of people who are just in the data ecosystem and messaging on Bluesky. And what we do is we ingest that starter pack and the list of all the users, and then we store that in our S3 bucket. In this case, we're using R2 from Cloudflare, which is a completely compatible storage layer for storing those objects. And we're doing dynamic partitioning. So we're actually using a pretty sophisticated feature of Dagster here, where we have this upstream asset where we ingest that starter pack. And then you can see on lines 23 through 26, we're adding to this dynamic partition of each user ID that was in that starter pack. And then downstream, when we want to ingest the user's feed, we have that partitioned by this dynamic partition. And so as that starter pack changes and your assets are materialized, the next time you materialize the user feed snapshot, it'll do it for all of the users that are relevant at that point in time. Looking at this a little bit more, you can see on line 7, we're using an automation condition just to run it on a cron schedule. But then our downstream assets are also using these automation conditions to just automatically materialize when the upstream has been updated. And I think that's all we want to talk about for this asset. Let's look at the next one, Alex. Yeah, and then we're also taking a snapshot of the user feeds, as I was alluding to. So you can see the left screenshot there. We have it partitioned by like day, and we're taking a snapshot of all of the messages that a given user has posted. And we did that intentionally so that we could, over time, kind of do more analysis on the engagement of those posts. So every time we take a snapshot, we'll have like the number of likes that a post has, and then we can see like how many posts happen over time and that engagement. Looking at the code on the right, you can see on line 2, that's where we use that dynamic partition. So we have this actor feed snapshot asset that's dynamically partitioned by the users that were a member of that starter pack. And we do that partition mapping there, saying we have an upstream dependency on that starter pack snapshot, and the partition mapping is just on all of those partitions. And then we have an automation condition just saying eager, which means when the upstream asset materialize this one too. You can see on lines 13, 14, 15, the kinds of like resources we're using. So we use our custom AT proto resource and then our S3 resource so that we can write those files to the bucket. And on lines 25 through 27, that's where we actually use the S3 resource to write the data that we're getting from the API. And one thing to note is on line 10, you can see we're setting this concurrency limit. I mentioned before that we were getting throttled pretty heavily, especially for this partitioned asset. So we actually limited the concurrency of our materializations for the partitions of this asset. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit too. Okay, hopefully this isn't too overwhelming, but yeah, I mentioned we have concurrency limits set on that asset. You can see on the left here in our dagster.yaml, we also have to specify that we want to set op level concurrency limits to 1. And because we assigned an op tag for concurrency limiting on that previous asset, that's how we prevent that from running too much. But even with those concurrency limits, we were running into throttling issues. So on the right, you can see we also employed the use of a library called Tenacity, which allows you to have retries with backoff. So we're calling this like get author feed method from our AT proto client. And if that fails, because we're wrapping it with this decorator, it'll actually retry. And we have it specified to retry 5 times with a backoff factor. In this case, it's waiting a fixed period of time. But these are some of the like real world implementations that we had to do to get this ingestion to work when you have like rate limiting, and especially in the context of Dagster, where we have all these partitions trying to run in parallel. And after we were able to get it to load the data in a resilient way, we were able to then go into the transformation step, where Alex will talk about how we're using DBT with DuckDB and MotherDuck pointing to this R2 bucket where our raw data is landing.
Yeah, so everybody knows that Dagster and DBT work really well together. And that's why we chose it as our transformation tool for this project. And one thing we did in this project is, and that MotherDuck helped significantly with, is we have in our profiles here, you can see that we configured both a DuckDB and a MotherDuck resource. So in our Dagster project, when we were done with our local development, we were very easily able to switch to our production sources by just like one line of code. And then we also, when we are reading off of the R2 bucket, added additional configuration using the S3 connection for DBT and DuckDB. So we could read straight off that R2 bucket and have our data right into our MotherDuck project. And more on that, we did additional configuration for our sources so we could map the specific Dagster assets to our DBT assets. And then since the S3 library didn't quite work well with the R2 abstraction, like it specified specifically like an S3 address instead of an R2 one. So we configured an external location here so that we could then blob select the JSON files that were written in the ingestion step, and it elegantly kicked off all our DBT projects. And finally, Power BI was the end tool that we wanted to have as a use case to show how to incorporate a business intelligence tool into your asset graph. And it's helpful because you can clearly map upstream dependencies, and you get a superior dashboard debugging experience. So if something's broken somewhere along the chain, you can clearly see it, and there's no more like tedious debugging and lengthy trying to figure out where something failed. And let's pop into the lineage graph for this so we can see what it looks like.
Yeah.
So like Colton mentioned, these are the ingestion assets over here. We have our staging reading right from R2. And then we have our DBT project over here. And finally, it feeds into the Power BI report. This asset is just like a table of 1 through 10 in Power BI, and that's how it's represented here.
Yeah, I just want to comment there briefly, like how much of a game changer that is to have the Power BI integration. In a couple of releases ago, Dagster actually created a few integrations with like Power BI, Looker, Tableau, Sigma, and because we have this full lineage with our DBT models going into our Power BI dashboard, when those DBT models are updated, you can actually trigger the Power BI dashboard to be updated as well. So it can call that API to refresh the dashboard so that it will be totally up to date when the upstream data is updating. It's a really cool feature.
Yeah, and this is the dashboard that we have. I think the most interesting graph here is this daily active posters. And as we saw, and I don't know if anyone in the audience participated in the ramp up in Bluesky, where there was a period of like really fast user onboarding and it was almost an explosion. It seems to have like kind of leveled off into a permanently higher plateau, we'll say. But like Bluesky is still one of my favorite places to go for like data specific content. And finally, the benefits of having everything in your data platform in your orchestrator tool is, of course, you have the same tried and tested ingestion and transformation frameworks where you can integrate with the best-in-class tools, and you can additionally build custom logic, which pretty much every organization needs to do to serve their data properly. And the benefit of using a tool like Dagster to do this is you can catch all the issues before they show up in their dashboard. So you can be a lot more proactive. And additionally, it gives business intelligence users better insights into their data assets and understanding their lineage. And since your orchestrator touches all the systems and processes in your data stack, it makes it the natural tool to build your system of record where you can do additional cataloging and data governance to really empower your organization to be far more effective with its data assets. And yeah, back to Bluesky. Starter packs were like a really unique way and a powerful way to onboard a lot of users really quickly. And I think that was definitely like powering the surge. And what I love about Bluesky is they don't punish outbound links like LinkedIn and Twitter do. So if someone has a cool project or a blog post or a video, when they share it, it doesn't get suppressed by the algorithm. And a lot of these topics, especially in the data space, lends itself to like medium to long form content. So when you have that way to share it around, it like enhances discoverability and I think improves the quality of the discussions. Jacob, Colton, what are your thoughts on Bluesky?
You want to go first, Jacob?
Sure. I mean, yeah, I think you know, part of the magic is definitely what you called out there, Alex, is like for specific in-depth domain content. There's no better place to find links about like the cutting edge, and so it's very, very useful there. But you know, the algorithm still rules all, and as much as you know, the Twitter algorithm is undeniably worse today than it was, you know, a couple years ago. You know, I think it's very hard, and this graph kind of points to this a little bit, which is like, hey, actually, the algorithm does matter for retention. We want to be seeing things we care about on a regular basis, and you know, it's a very hard problem to solve. And so, but
Yeah.
yeah, overall, very pleased with Bluesky and being able to kind of interact with people and actually share the stuff I'm working on and links and media in a way that most of the people who follow me see it. And then the same on, you know, people I follow, I see their stuff, which is great.
Yeah. I still almost use exclusively Blue Sky. I'll check Twitter every now and then, and I'm always surprised by like how much more entertaining I find the content on Twitter after I've been using Blue Sky for a bit. But like the technical engagement has been really good.
Yeah.
Though, for example, like I stopped seeing Alex's posts, even though he was still posting, and that was because we didn't have a like certain algorithm that was like driving me to see that kind of content. Instead, I was just seeing the most recent posts from the people that I follow.
Mhm.
But I still think Blue Sky is a really awesome platform, and I hope that even though it's kind of like plateauing out now, it's still much higher than it was before. And I hope it has like a second wave possibly where it grows again.
Mhm.
Awesome. And then Jacob, do you want to talk about fast feedback loops with both Dagster and MotherDuck?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we'll just do a quick kind of run through here. So MotherDuck is built on top of DuckDB, which is an open source SQL engine. And what that means is, like Alex showed earlier, when you actually, once you get the data kind of in your R2 bucket, uh, you can run everything locally, kind of experiment, get it working. And then once you're ready, you can kind of flip the switch to prod. And I think that workflow is a very powerful workflow that you can only really enable with something like DuckDB and MotherDuck. So, you know, I think we'll kind of hit on like all those pieces here. You know, it's super fast because you're using it locally. It uses this notion of morsel-driven parallelism to kind of break up everything into a bunch of pieces and run it in parallel. You get some really fun advanced SQL, like in the DBT example you saw, we were invoking the read new line delimited JSON function, so you can just read straight out of the bucket. And then, of course, it can read those files like the JSON, and it handles authentication. So that's all seamless. And the user interactivity piece is really just using SQL, and they're not thinking about all the other pieces that you need to make it work. And so that's kind of the DuckDB part. And then if you want to go to the next slide, how MotherDuck thinks about this is really, I'll call out three things. The first one on the right, we talked about already, which is this notion of dual execution. You can run kind of locally and in the cloud. You can also do that together, bounce back and forth between them very scalably. It's a single node, so you know, if I'm running a query and Alex is running the query, we're isolated from each other. We're not going to make the server run slowly. For those of you who are working with, like, you know, let's say OLTP databases like Postgres, you know how it can be once you reach a certain level of saturation. You're just waiting, waiting for your query to complete. And then, you know, lastly, you know, it is serverless, so you get billed when it's used, and you don't get billed when it's not. And it's simplified model to manage the resources. And again, getting from DuckDB to MotherDuck is as simple as adding 3 letters to your connection string, which is MD colon.
All right, shifting left in data engineering. First, what is shifting left? So, shifting left is something that originally comes from the cybersecurity industry, and it's all about moving quality and security concerns earlier in the development process. This minimizes breaking changes and data quality issues, and documentation is often overlooked when doing data work. And honestly, it's a big part of this. And adhering to software engineering best practices is something that in the data space we're kind of like 5 years behind where the best and brightest like software engineers and front end devs are about. So by bringing those software engineering best practices to shift left in our data process, we can improve accuracy, onboard new team members more effectively, and improve our developer productivity from less context switching and reactive work. And platform complexity is a big part of the need to do this because data platforms are rarely simple. You likely have a ton of tools, data sources, contributors, consumers, and unique business logic. And you need to take a thoughtful approach in order to cut through this kind of Gordian knot and make the data platform work with the organization and not be a bear for you as the data engineer to maintain it. And like we've all seen Reddit posts or just like posts in general where data engineers are like pulling their hair out because they feel like they're just like keeping the lights on and doing all this reactive work, and they never get any time to like sit down, work on some data project that'll move the business forward. And then their leadership teams are frustrated because anytime they have a new request, and especially a new valid request, where the data engineers are like, our backlog's too big, we can't take on any new things. But that's not really a acceptable answer. Like you need to come with solutions here. And that brings us to the path forward. And like a big part of this, if you can configure your development environment effectively for your team, that puts you in the 90th percentile of data teams because a lot of folks have not considered this and have also not put in the work to manage all this. So with local development, you want to bring your prod environment as close to your development environment as possible. And there's a few ways to do this. A lot of people use Docker containers. At Dagster, we use a mono repo and have a robust CI/CD and testing suite. And that brings us to CI/CD. You need to thoughtfully think about this and catch things before they go to prod. In Dagster, we have this feature called branch deployments that allows you to create a staging environment off of a PR from your data platform. And so you can use production data without having to use the production environment. So you're able to test things as close as possible. And it's a fantastic way to catch those like final bugs that may appear before merging into production. And finally, access and partitions. I know for me, security things are often the bane of my existence when doing projects. And like, if we didn't have to do this, if hackers were nice, we could all be 1,000,000% more effective. But that's just not the world we live in. So like, you want to have it easy for new members to get the keys and credentials they need, and then also have like a security and governance framework that doesn't introduce excess friction and is actually about securing the environment and empowering people to do what they need. And how you shift left with Dagster, it doesn't have to be this way, essentially. With asset checks. So you can catch data quality issues before they become an issue, like in a dashboard. And you can code these with custom Python logic, or you can use an external tool like Great Expectations. And also, as part of our DBT integration, DBT tests will come through and materialize as asset checks. So you can use the tool that you're most comfortable with to implement data quality most effectively. Additionally, we also have freshness checks. So you can see and you'll get notified if a data asset hasn't been run in a certain amount of time. So you can have these sort of like SLAs in your organizations to make sure that the data is where it needs to be and is correct, and there's minimal questions so people can focus on interpreting the results instead of poking holes in everything, which often derails these discussions. And like I mentioned earlier, we have branch deployments. So you don't have to test in production, and every branch PR that you create creates a unique environment and allows for a real-time staging preview, and it has its like own UI. And this is a Dagster Plus feature, so it's not available in open source. And that brings us to modern data workflows. So it's 2025. We would be remiss if we didn't mention AI and how we've been using AI tools to improve our productivity. I mean, you can always go with the classic, just kind of prompting a ChatGPT or Claude interface for answering questions. Colton, I don't know if you want to talk about RAGs and how we use them with Dagster.
Yeah. Yeah. So I actually found when developing Dagster pipelines that a lot of times like ChatGPT or Claude don't exactly have the context that I need for doing the development that I'm working on. But funnily enough, we have an Ask AI version of ChatGPT that has been trained or given the context of Dagster documentation, Dagster discussions on GitHub, and things like that. And it's embedded in our Docs website and also in our Slack. But when we were working on this project, I was asking it all sorts of questions, and it had the actual understanding of how you're supposed to build pipelines in Dagster. So it gave really good answers and wrote a lot of the code that you see in this project. So I find that when you have RAG with your LLMs, they can do really, really good work and get you like 90% of the way there, so that you don't have to go through the documentation and search or search through all the GitHub discussions. It has all that context right at its fingertips, and it works really well for some of these use cases.
Yeah, and I think like something that's worth mentioning with using RAGs is that like the big models, they're trained on like all the corpus of text that they could get out there. And for newer tools, there often isn't as big of a backlog of like training data. So the AI models kind of fumble when it comes to like a tool like Dagster. So for new cutting edge tools, better tools, you want to utilize these RAGs to like get the benefits of this performance while also the productivity that AI tools allowed. So you're not like stuck with using legacy tooling just because that's what the AI is comfortable with.
Yeah, and I did find still when you're using these LLMs to try to assist you with your code, it's still extremely beneficial to understand what you're asking. So, because like if you are asking it questions without like an understanding of like the implementation of Dagster or like best practices, it can still give you wrong answers. So, I will say that using like AI autocomplete or these like chatbots to assist my development hasn't been an entire replacement of my development workflow. I still really need to like understand things so that I know the questions to ask. I'm curious, Jacob, what your experience is with those, and like if you're using AI completion in your editors and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think we can do we want to jump to the next slide here, Alex?
Yeah.
And I can kind of talk a little bit about how we're thinking about this from a MotherDuck perspective and what this means for, our experience. So I think broadly, if I frame the people using data, we can kind of put people in these buckets. So we have business users, kind of asking questions. We've got folks who are in this data scientist analyst bucket who are, building and analyzing data sets. And then, kind of upstream of that, we have data engineers. I guess I should have maybe moved these the other order, Alex, so we could shift these left. All right. Anyways, we're shifting right here. But I think there's different AI use cases for each of these. And, from a MotherDuck perspective, we're really thinking about how we make it easy for SQL to be the language that communicates across all of these pieces, right? Where you have people who are very deep, on the DBA side with SQL, and then you have business users who maybe have never written a SQL query ever. And so if you go to the next slide, Alex, so we're thinking about a couple things. So the first thing is inside of MotherDuck, we have this notion of text to SQL built in, which is lets you write natural language questions against your queries or against your data set, and then get back a SQL query, or it can just run it directly, right? And so that really accelerates, especially for people who maybe come from Python or R and want to, be able to interact with it in SQL. So that's kind of the first thing. So we have text to SQL kind of built in. We also have our own model trained on DuckDB SQL as well. And so we're actually training a second one right now so that you can get even better, more accurate DuckDB SQL kind of in your queries. And what that really means is that instead of getting like 80% right the first time, we get to like 90+%, which is great. For simple queries, obviously the quality of your table names and columns, et cetera, really matters here, because that's like the interface here is the schema. So that's the first thing we're thinking about. If you go to the next slide, the next thing we're thinking about is the model I was just talking about, which is this notion of hey, DuckDB in SQL, this is actually on Hugging Face. Really what that lets you do is, and I use this all the time, to say, hey, like, how do I solve this one thing? Or like, what's the specific syntax for this specific DuckDB query? I can just kind of write out an estimate of it, and our our product will fix it. And so, like, again, you kind of need to, it lets you kind of more focus on the problem. As we work through the rest of the slides here, you know, there, as you'll see, there's kind of more AI, or there's different kind of modularity or modalities for different folks to use it. So if you go to the next slide, Alex, we can talk about business users, which is, again, hey, once you have text to SQL but fed by a semantic layer, let's say something like Cube, well, again, you can then use natural language to interact with it. And again, this is all stuff we're thinking about at MotherDuck and putting it right at your fingertips inside of SQL functions. And so, yeah, I think that's the last piece I had here, kind of around AI and workflows. And again, you know, Colton, you talked about this right bucket, which is that blue circle, right? IDEs, Windsurf, you know, Cursor, etc. You know, for more generalized tasks, we're trying to think about how we make it more narrow, more quick, more easy to use, and tie all these pieces together.
Yeah, and before we go into the Q&A, we have a fun and exciting deep dive coming up in February, where we're going to talk about one of our new integrations with Not Diamond and Dagster. And Not Diamond is a router for LLMs, so it improves accuracy, reduces cost, doing all those fun data AI related things that we love to hear. So that'll be a good one. So make sure you follow us on socials and join our community Slack so you don't miss any updates.
Yeah, I think going back to that model routing, like continuing the trend of talking about some AI like advancements, I think this is a really cool one where a lot of times with like ChatGPT, there are a variety of models that you can use, and some of them cost more, some of them have better answers, but it's not entirely clear which one might be best for the prompt that you're using. And what Not Diamond is doing is it'll automatically tell you which model to use given the context of the question you're asking, so that you can optimize it for accuracy or cost effectiveness or things like that. So yeah, definitely tune in for that one. Cool. Q&A. So we've had a few questions already. I think maybe we'll reiterate some of the questions that have already been asked, just out loud. If you do have any questions, feel free to throw them in Q&A. There was one question about setting the concurrency limits for the DBT project. Jacob, I think you suggested that it is still best practice to set threads to 1. Is that right?
Yeah, so DuckDB is kind of unique compared to other databases in that it handles the parallelism for you. You can set the thread count to higher, and it won't negatively impact your run. But it is not like, I don't know, using Postgres or Snowflake, where you're like, oh, I want this to be 16 times faster. I will change my thread count to 16. It doesn't quite work that way because of how the parallelism is at the process level instead of at the I guess like job level. So there's a whole bunch of nuance kind of we could unpack within that, but yes, one should be in theory as fast as 4 or 8 or 16. The slowdown is typically because of a network overhead, so you might want to run it on more than one, maybe run it on 3 or 4.
Gotcha. And then Phil asked a couple of questions that I wanted to reiterate. So the first one was, and maybe Alex, if you have the code at hand, he asked, can you show how you connect the Power BI assets to the upstream data assets? And we did define a translator for our DBT assets, but we did still just use the table name as the asset name. And it just happened to be with how the Power BI integration is written and how the DBT integration is written, there is a source asset for the Power BI asset that is the table name. So it automatically had that kind of lineage determined just because the upstream matched that of the DBT model. But you can customize those things in the translators for both of these integrations. And admittedly, that's like one of the more confusing parts about setting up these projects. And I always have to go back to the documentation and be like, okay, how do I set this like upstream dependency again? And you can see that here on lines 31 through 33. So we're in this translator, the method's getting this Power BI translator data, And from there, it has this properties.get tables, and that's how it's kind of specifying those upstream dependencies for this asset. I hope that makes sense. I encourage you to poke around in the code base. If you have any questions, or if you see any issues with it, you can even open an issue in our repo. And then Phil also asked, what happens to the dynamic partitions if a user disappears? Do you still try to get their posts? And it's actually funny that you asked that, because that is a limitation of how we've implemented this so far. So every time we take a snapshot of the starter pack, we add that list of users to that dynamic partition, but we never remove them from the dynamic partition. So it'll continue to grow even if a user is removed from the starter pack. You can go and like clear out that dynamic partition before you update it. That would be a pretty simple code improvement. And then you kind of asked also like what happens if that user disappears. I don't know if you're asking like if that user was deleted, but we still had them in our dynamic partition. If that were the case, we would still be trying to get their posts. And I don't know if their API will return an error or if it'll just return no results, but that is also something to consider. And I think a future improvement to the ingestion portion of this code base would be to prune the dynamic partition before updating it again.
Yeah,
Cool.
I'm seeing another question in here from Duncan about if we are doing anything special with Cursor to optimize it. And like, is it possible to bring a RAG in with Cursor to do development with that? I personally haven't used Cursor or Windsurf, but I'd be curious to hear from the others if you guys have used those IDEs and how you get that to work for you.
Sure, I can talk about that. Most of my experiences with Windsurf, I'm assuming Cursor has the same functionality, but like for example, if I'm working specifically on data workflows with SQL, I will get the DuckDB docs. You can get them as a Markdown file, and I will add that kind of to my to my RAG step in Windsurf. It has like you can like prepend the prompts. And so that's helpful in kind of generating a little bit of context there. I think the answer to this is it's early days. I don't think we've seen a data specific IDE yet. So I'm sure there's one baking right now or in the current YC batch that we will see soon. But there's definitely enhancements that we can get to, but I don't have anything more specific than sometimes it helps to put your docs in the RAG function. I don't know, Colton, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I also admittedly, like similar to Alex, haven't used Cursor or Windsurf, but I just find myself using our RAG-based ChatGPT in our docs. But I would like to see us improve that support, and I need to explore it too myself. Yeah. We're getting a lot of questions. I saw somebody actually ask about Omni as their dashboarding tool. And Walter, we are actually in talks with them to see what it would take to build an Omni integration. We actually use Omni internally within Dagster for our pipelines or visualizations. You asked, is it possible for me to write a custom integration external asset so that I can represent my downstream dashboards? Yeah, you could totally create an external asset that represents that dashboard. But I think if we were to write an integration, you would want to build out that functionality where you could potentially refresh that dashboard if the upstream assets are materialized. But if that weren't the case, you could just create an external asset and then it's not really linked to anything, but you would have that lineage view. And you could maybe put like some metadata on it with a link to the dashboard. I think that would be step one. But yeah, we're in the works to figure out what it would take to get an integration with them. That's something that we're excited for too.
Yeah, and then Lawrence asked about like how we're using Bluesky to stay up to date with data content. So a feed you're going to want to follow is another Dagster member, Christian Minnick. He created a starter pack for like the data folks, and that's what we used for this project here. And that'll give you like the nucleus of data Twitter that you can kind of start with. And we'll share the link to that in our deep dive Slack channel on the Dagster Slack as a follow-on to this.
Nice. Oh, Walter also asked about the DBT freshness checks. I actually am not sure of that off the top of my head. I know in DBT on your model, you can specify with like the freshness keyword, those kinds of checks. I know for like data quality checks in DBT, we automatically pull those out with the DBT integration and model them as asset checks. We might do that with the freshness checks too, but I would need to double check on that. But that's a good question. Um, Alex, you might want to take this one where Michael
Yeah.
asked about the advantages of using Dagster over other tools like Prefect.
Well, you should use Dagster because it's the best orchestrator out there, full stop. But more seriously, Prefect is good for doing event-driven workflows.
Yeah.
But I have heard that their open source version is rather limited and that they gate a lot of the good stuff behind the paid tier. Whereas with like Dagster open source, it gives you pretty much, sales will hate me for saying this, but it gives you pretty much everything you need. And we've actually seen in our community a lot of folks build pretty powerful and performant data platforms just from using open source.
Yeah,
And
and I will say also with Dagster, like Alex said, where Prefect is more event driven, it is kind of like a different paradigm and methodology when you're working with Dagster and you have this like asset-centric approach where you're modeling all of the assets, the like things that are being built, like the tables and the dashboards, and you have this full lineage. And it suits itself really well for data pipelines. So I would say that's a pretty big differentiator. And asset-centric pipeline development in Dagster is like a first-class citizen. It's how we've been doing things for a long time now. So the support for it is really good.
I will just add, and Alex, I just DM'd you the link. As someone who's not at Dagster, I ask those same questions of myself, and I think Nick, I think he's one of the co-founders at Dagster, talked on a podcast that I just sent the link to Alex to about, the notion of graphs versus kind of tasks and jobs, and I think that really lit up something for me in terms of really understanding kind of it's a different approach. Graph guarantees are different than job guarantees, and that's way in the weeds of the technical implementation here, but it does really matter, especially for complex pipelines. And so as you think about what that means for your implementation, on the small scale, it won't really matter too much. But once you get to a big implementation, it can be very hard when you're using something that has a bunch of dependent jobs that are kind of orchestrated bottoms up instead of top down.
Mm.
I've personally experienced a lot of that pain at a previous company where we built our own orchestrator. Please do not do that.
All right. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. I have another one for you, Jacob, actually asking, does
Sure.
MotherDuck have driver support to connect to a data source via the driver? This is something I'm not too familiar with. Maybe something we can look up offline, but I'm curious if you know.
I don't know. Hang on. Is there more context on that
Yes,
question?
yeah. So the question says, does MotherDuck have driver support to connect to the data source via the driver? I don't know if this is like a JDBC type connection.
So there is a JDBC driver, and there's like native Python and C API and a Node API, all kind of part of DuckDB, which mean they work seamlessly with MotherDuck. I don't have a better answer to that question. I'm happy to kind of, DM me on Twitter or, send me an email, Matson@MotherDuck if you want, if you want more to that. But we try to be pretty open in terms of how it connects. And there's high level APIs and low level APIs, just depending on where you want to fit it into your stack. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Jacob. Do you see any other questions, Alex, that we'd like to address?
Yeah, what kind of quality checks that are found more in the left part of the pipeline versus the right side? For example, more of a focus on freshness. I know a check that often creates changes in the work I've done in the past is just like schema changes. So being able to monitor if a upstream like table add a new column, removed a column, and being able to catch that without having to see a job broke is it has been really helpful in my like data workflows because I feel like that captures like 60% of the errors that I saw at a previous role. and being able to see those upstream saved me a ton of time.
Cool. Well, I think that's it. As a reminder, we have the Dagster Deep Dive channel in the Dagster Slack. So if you want to continue this conversation there, we'll be hanging out. And then we'll be posting the recording of this deep dive soon. And I encourage you to check out the code base, to check out MotherDuck. And if you have any questions, feel free to message Alex, me, or Jacob. Yeah, we're super excited to share this project we've been working on. And we hope you learned something interesting in this webinar.